Uh, so I'm going to talk about sustaining agile transformations. And here we have a set of animals jumping around. Does anyone know what these animals are? The name of the animal?
Yeah, wildebeest.
Wildebeest, yes.
Wow, very, very impressive. Yeah. Wildebeest, I think that's how they're pronounced. So
Yeah.
they've been around for 2.5 million years, which is a very long period of time. And they're not very smart, but they have succeeded in lasting much, much longer than any corporation has, for sure. And they will probably continue long after any corporation that currently exists. And so this is what I mean by sustained, right? Sustained means that, in many, 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 many different situations, the agile effort continues. So it doesn't depend on a particular person, a particular CEO, particular economic conditions, particular product, or anything like that. It is something that is able to persist through many, 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 many different conditions. And of course, this is a vision. No one has, produced this or seen this, but this is the goal, right? And the second thing, of course, is that it doesn't require an agile coach to be sitting there the whole time, sort of creating the agility in the organization. Now, the likelihood of this is very low. And I'll say this simply because we human beings are not very good at just following our own advice, even when it comes to extreme sort of life-threatening situations. Like there are these very, very well-known studies where they take a group of people who have some condition and they say, if you keep doing this, that condition will get worse and worse and worse. And if you stop doing it, things will get better, right? So you can think of something like smoking and lung cancer, right? And in these studies, like a very, 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 very tiny percentage of people are actually able to stop smoking, even though they have lung cancer, right? Or you look at like the food choices that we make, right? Like we know pretty well that, highly processed foods with lots of sugar in them are not good for our health. And yet these are consumed, certainly in the United States, in absolutely vast, monstrous quantities. And so even when there's like enormous amount of data that something harmful is happening, we human beings have a great, very, very difficult time making changes. So we have an uphill battle because in addition to all of that, right, there's just the simple fact that agile stuff typically has medium-term and long-term payoffs. And so in some sense, we're always playing this marshmallow game. So the marshmallow game, for those of you who haven't heard of it, is this experiment that was done with very young kids, where they put a marshmallow in front of the kid and they said, don't eat the marshmallow. If you don't eat it for 30 minutes, you'll get 2 marshmallows, right? And so you're sitting there looking at the marshmallow, you're saying no to the marshmallow, and then you get 2 marshmallows after 30 minutes. And it turns out that the people who can do that, the 7-year-old kids who can do that, they have all sorts of benefits throughout life, right? Because they're able to invest in longer term periods of time. But very, very few people are able to do this. And so we see this constant problem, just with human beings. Like we have a very, very, very difficult time thinking about what we should be doing today that will pay off 18 months from now. It's all what's good for me right now, what's good for me right now, what's good for me right now. And so since a lot of agile stuff pays off over longer periods of time, it's really, really difficult, right? It's really, really, really difficult to create these sustaining agile transformations. And so that's what the topic of this seminar is going to be. And I'm going to invite you to go into a Google Doc and just talk about a little bit about what you want to get out of this presentation. And I'll share it with you here in a second once I pull it up.
Right, I think we have everyone back.
Yep, excellent. So the approach that I'm going to be discussing here is called Invitational Agile Coaching. And in an Invitational Agile Coaching approach, what the Agile coach does is they operate entirely via invitation. And so that does not mean that the Agile coach doesn't share their expertise. It doesn't mean that anything goes. It means that people choose the level of activity that they want to do. And they also choose the goals and the mechanism to get to those goals, right? So here's an example from the book. So in a coaching organization where the work was being done at a fairly high level, there was this understanding after a whole bunch of impediments were removed that there was a set of managers that were just uninterested in any change. And this was not something that came from the Agile coaches. This is something that came from the client themselves. They said, we're not able to make progress here because of this set of people. And so the Agile coach said, what is it that you would like to do about that? And they put together a plan. And then the plan was not executed. And so the Agile coach convened the group and had a conversation about that. Everyone agreed that it hadn't been executed. Everyone agreed that these folks were still the impediment to the improvement, et cetera. And so they tried again. But again, the plan was not executed in any way, so the impediment was still there. And this went on for a couple more times. And the Agile coach said, well, it looks like we've reached the end of the road here because there's this impediment. Everyone says that there's an impediment. There's a path to removing the impediment, but you don't want to execute on it, right? And so that was the end of that engagement. That organization got to the point where it was effectively saying no and yes simultaneously, and the actions were winning out over the verbal state, right? And so that's just a very, very clean way of seeing how the Agile coach applies all of their knowledge, experience, and wisdom, but the client is always in the driver's seat, making the decision and deciding explicitly whether or not to move forward, right? And the client makes the final decision. The coach might be a source of information. The other folks have other sources of information that they look at, but they ultimately decide, right? So the client is constantly in choice, and so there's no friction, right? And so if we look at this boat, for example, you have this, pretty difficult thing that's happening here. People look like they're going from being on the boat to being on shore. And there's some help and support that's being provided here. And some people are going across. Some people may not be interested in going across, and they may be interested in staying on the boat. And that's it. You let go of that and don't keep trying to change the situation that doesn't want to be changed. One of the things that I want to be super clear about is that there are these views about change itself in the Agile community that are probably not quite right. So one of them is that change is difficult. So if I give everyone $1 million, that's a change, but it's not a difficult change, right? It's a very, very simple change, right? So change intrinsically is not necessarily difficult. What is difficult, of course, is what we discussed before, which is sort of the long-term versus the short-term trade-off. And one of the issues that we constantly have in the Agile community is that Agile coaches are sort of naturally disposed to making massive investments that pay off over long periods of time, whereas most people and most organizations are not like that. And so there's this constant friction, right? So an Agile coach will say something like, if only you put a lot more time into creating automated tests, it will pay off in the future, I promise you. And really, there's just an issue there of the time horizon and the investment. It's not that the one is right or wrong, is that one group has a different understanding of what their local self-interest is than the other group. And that's where the friction is, right? There isn't typically an actual disagreement on the facts of the matter. And so I just wanted to share that with you. And so the easy way to solve that problem, right, is just to offer the information and then let go of any particular outcome, any particular action that the person is going to take, right? So here, the help is being offered, the support is being offered, the way ahead is being offered. Like, you can use all of your expertise and wisdom as you see fit here. But then it's always the client that decides what next step to take. And whether the client says yes or no, it's totally fine. We're all experiencing this, or at least many people are experiencing this right now because of the world economic situation, right? So I, and many organizations, I have spoken to them about, it's a good idea to have resilience and robustness inside of your organization because things can change very quickly for the worse. And you need to be ready for it because when bad things happen, it's already too late. But year after year after year, there are now many people who have not experienced a serious financial crisis since the 2008 global financial crisis. So a lot of time has passed, 10 plus years have passed since the economy was down, there was massive unemployment, there was massive problems with the stock market, slowdown in growth. And so people say like, well, I've never experienced this in my lifetime. My group has always grown. My revenues have always increased. Things have always been better and better. So I'm going to ignore you, right? And now today, those folks are of course in deep trouble, but they chose, right? The key thing is that they chose what time horizon that they wanted to optimize for, right? And so the way that we overcome resistance is by not creating it, right? So the way we overcome resistance is by not creating it and always giving the authority to the client, right? Always giving the authority to the client, right? So the client chooses, the coach can help create options, right? The coach can even give opinions. The coach can provide data, can provide case studies, can say, in my experience, but the client decides what to go. Now, at some point, the coach might say, like in the example I gave before, oh, there's nothing else to do here because you've identified an impediment, you refuse to move it, so you're at the end of the road, so my job here is over. Now, that can always happen, and just that's the Agile coach saying, there's no utility in this conversation anymore. So this is not some weird psychological trick where you get someone else to agree with you. They might actually disagree with you, and that might be the end of the thing. So we'll go back into the document here and we'll do exercise number 2, which is about where do you see resistance in your organization. So let's go into the breakout rooms and then you'll spend just like 1 minute typing in where you see resistance in the organization that you work in now or in an organization that you've worked on in the past, and then we'll just do a share. So let's go ahead and go into breakout rooms for 7 minutes now.
All right, that should be everyone back now.
Okay, excellent. So the key idea in the book, the way that you overcome resistance is to not create it in the first place. And the way to not create it in the first place is to provide options, to participate in brainstorming, but to let the client decide. And so here's one simple trap that Agile coaches often find themselves in, and here's how to get out of it, which is an Agile coach will say, well, this team doesn't want to do X. And okay, well, if the team doesn't want to do it, then just they don't want to do it. It's their choice. I say, no, because my manager wants me to get the team to do X. Okay. So what's the problem there? The problem there is that the Agile coach has allowed them to be put into that situation, right? So as an Agile coach, you should not allow yourself to be put into a situation where you are trying to get someone to do something, right? That virtually guarantees resistance. And then it puts you into this very, very odd role where you effectively are doing what a manager would do, except that you are not actually the manager. And so then you get into these very, very terrible, twisted situations where Agile coaches are trying to be nice, or they're trying to facilitate change, or they're trying to be persuasive, or to have influence. So, very often when I go into an engagement, I will say, I just want to be clear, right? I'm not changing your organization. You're changing your organization. What is the mechanism of change in your organization? And if there is no mechanism of change in the organization, then there's nothing to discuss, right? But the organization has to have the mechanism of change, right? Not the Agile coach. The Agile coach themselves cannot be the mechanism of change, because then you're exactly in this situation where there's a group of people that wants A and there's a group of people that wants not A, and it's the Agile coach that's in between. That is not the proper role, in our opinion, of what an Agile coach should be doing, right? And that's what creates this sort of endless friction and all of the problems that Agile coaches have, where they're saying, well, they say they want it, but they don't actually want it. That's something for the organization to decide to do, right? So going back to that original example, there was this group of managers that was just not signed on to making some change. The Agile coach didn't say, I'm going to go in there and convince them to do it, or persuade them, or to influence them. The Agile coach said, oh, okay, how do you want to solve the problem? And when the organization said, here's how we want to solve the problem, then repeatedly failed to solve the problem, said, look, we're going to let these managers go. Then the Agile coach says, well, in my opinion, there's nothing more to do here, right? So I want to just be very clear that that is a trap, in my opinion. Like, there's no pleasant way to get out of that. Like, there's no pleasant way to get out. And that's how Agile coaches become the Agile police and become people who, give assessments and say you're getting an F on Agile and I'm going to tell your manager, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why people wind up getting so upset at Agile coaches, and engineers write, blog articles about how Agile coaches are terrible. Okay. So I'm going to pause here and ask, are there any comments or questions at this point?
One I had, Michael, which I asked you in the session previously as well. I'm imagining you work at the C-suite and the senior management level, the senior leadership level, yeah, as an enterprise Agile coach. Grant, just give me 1 minute. I'll quickly go through it and then you can, yeah. So my typical experience has been, they all agree to it, but it's more of a lip service. They are for it, but as far as taking difficult decisions, what I mean is the organizational changes, etc. Yeah, they are very reluctant to take that up. The fear is really, how is that going to affect? So how do you handle such a situation?
Yes, so I'll just agree with what you said and then just say, what's reasonable to do. So one thing that has happened, and I think maybe everyone has seen this chart of like how many years a large company stays as a large company. So there's this wonderful chart from Deloitte. If you've never seen it, just send me an email and I'll show it to you. But basically, it used to be the case that large companies were large companies for long periods of time, like 50 years, and then when it became 30, then 20, then 10, or something like that, right? So companies are getting disrupted at a faster rate. And also what's happening is that executive level tenure is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. there's some like ridiculously short period of time right now. Like we're like the average C-level executive will be in their job for less than 3 years. So they need to produce a result within 12 months, maybe 18 months, cash in on it in their final year, and then they're out of there, right? So anything that looks even remotely difficult is completely outside of their zone of planning, of their zone of strategy, right? And so that typically includes virtually all forms of significant culture change, right? Which is typically what Agile coaches lead with, right? They say, well, we're going to change culture, then we're going to bring in these practices. I think just the empirical fact is that no one has actually seen a large corporation, say 3,000 people or more, change their culture. Like no one has actually ever seen that happen, right? So for those of you who are familiar with Laloux's Reinventing Organizations, he has sort of a classification of different types of cultures. Most organizations are orange cultures in his classification, which means that they're essentially optimizing for financial factors. They're trying to make more money. Green is where we start to get collaborative, right? No one has seen a large organization go from orange to green. Like that just has not been seen, right? And so what that means is that you're going to start with an orange organization, an organization that's optimizing for money and doesn't really care about people. And you're going to end up with an organization that cares about money and doesn't really care about people. And so as soon as you're sort of humble in the face of that reality, and don't think that you as the Agile coach are going to catalyze a culture change in an organization, then things become much easier, right? Because then you say, okay, how can I make more money for this person? Right? And then when that becomes the problem, then you can actually start thinking about how to actually support the person who's hired you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah,
Yes.
Grant, over to you.
Cool, thank you. Apologies for arriving late, so you may have covered this. But when I sort of dropped in, there was the boat, and there was the boat on one side and the rock on the other. Now, I couldn't tell which way people were going, whether they were going from the boat to the rock or the rock to the boat. And, you know, when you were talking about these managers that were the impediment, is that from the perspective of the leaders, or are the managers, is their perspective that the management is the problem? So when you're getting into this, when you sort of start a coaching game, you have a coaching agreement, and you sort of discuss how you have those hard questions and those hard conversations. Are you almost devolving responsibility back to the say, well, if you don't want to have the hard conversation, we're not going to do this. It's, you know, whatever you want. Is that? Have I made myself clear, or is that?
Yeah. So so to answer the small question that you asked, which was, yes, it was the opinion of the executives that these managers were the challenge.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and what I want to, that's also, I think, just part of being humble, right? So Agile coaches, to a large degree, are sort of anti-hierarchy. And in fact, if you've gone through like the ICF certification, it says that, you know, one of the coach's jobs is to make sure that every voice is heard, even voices that are not heard very much, right? Again, let's be humble in the face of what exists, which is that just about every large organization is an extremely strict hierarchy, right? Much, much more worse than any government, because at the top, you know, the prime minister, someone can actually disagree with the prime minister. In a corporation, no one can disagree with the CEO. The CEO can instantaneously like fire anyone, double someone's salary, right? Like they have complete and total power. And so if one starts off by saying, well, I am going to transform that, wow, I've never actually seen that. So what's likely is that there was a hierarchy on day one, and there will be a hierarchy on the day 100, right? And so if the senior executives say, this is the truth, they are not inviting a conversation about that typically. They are not inviting, please challenge me, right? And tell me that it's not the truth, right? They're saying, this is the problem. And then they're saying, well, but we don't really want to solve it in that particular example. And so that was it, right?
Is that what the people at potentially Polaroid or Blockbuster or Nokia thought? This is the truth, and that was the truth right up until that snake bit them in the ass. Let's say. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And,
Yeah.
and look, so that is another thing, right? Which is, my advice to Agile coaches who think that they can save large multinational corporations is to go try it. Like, go become a senior executive and save a multinational corporation, right? And so one has to be just very, very careful about that, right? Like, my experience of people in organizations that are not doing well is that they're trying really, really, really hard to do well, right? They're not like mailing it in, they're not quitting, right? They're actually all trying to do their best to be successful. And just, the forces of competition mean that not everyone can be successful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so here I was going to just talk about the difficulty of change. So there are these zones in the world called blue zones. And these are zones where, like, there are an extremely large number of people who are 100 plus years old or 90 plus years old, right? And so they analyze what happens in these blue zones, and they found these, 5 things. So maintain a healthy body weight, enjoy regular physical exercise, which means breathe heavy and sweat 5 to 10 hours per week. Eat lots of fruits and vegetables, 5 vegetables per day. So that's like 5 cups of vegetables per day. Keep making good social connections and drink less alcohol, right? So, like, here's a recipe for living to be 90 plus years old for many people, or adding 10 years to one's life. And yet it's extremely difficult to do for just about everyone, right? I mean, like, this is like proven, hundreds of thousands of scientists, et cetera, just eat 5 cups of vegetables per day. And this affects your life, right? The problem is that it affects your life 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now. And there's not a very clear connection between cause and effect, right? If you had like a big clock that said, here's how long you're going to live, and every time you ate a vegetable, it like added a day to it, then that would be a lot easier, right? But it's tough, right? It's tough, right? And so even for this stuff that's so incredibly clear, or at least as proven, it's very, very difficult to shift behavior. And so imagine when, an Agile coach comes in and said, it would be really nice if the product manager and the engineering manager got along better, because then the product will be better. And it would be really nice if you talk to your users, right? It's just very, very, very difficult to argue that position. And then the attempt to argue that position then is what creates resistance. And then what causes people just to say, okay, I'll do whatever it is that you want while you're in the room. And then when you're not in the room, I'm going to do whatever I want, right? So that creates resistance and destroys sustainability, right? And so it's very, very valuable to think about you yourself being the primary reason how these things are going to happen, just sort of by the way that you live. So there's this famous quote that everyone knows about: be the change that you want to see in the world, right? So if you want more collaboration in a workplace, ask where you're not collaborating well and improve your collaboration, for example. But then there's actually this other quote also from Mahatma Gandhi, which is even deeper and more interesting in my opinion, right? So he says, we mirror the world. All the tendencies present in the outer world are to be found in the world of our body. So whatever we see outside is present inside, okay? And then he says, the causality can work backwards too. So if we change ourselves, the tendencies in the world would also change, right? As a man changes his own nature, so does the attitude of the world change towards him, right? So, and then finally, we need not wait to see what others do, right? So if you want to create a change in the outside world, create the change in yourself first. Right? This means letting go of what you want. You know, if what you care about is what you want, then you should expect the other person to care about what they want, and then you're going to just have resistance. So someone has to start first, and it's going to be you, right? So that can be very scary, but you can't ask the other person to be doing something that you're not, right? If you're being pig-headed and stubborn and saying this is the right way to go, then you should expect the other person to be pig-headed and stubborn and say that this is the right way to go. One thing that I think is always very, very important is that the most important thing is a healthy relationship. So, you know, these guys here are having a lot of fun. They're probably not going to get very far, but they're having a lot of fun. So that's an opportunity to build on it, right? If they're not having a lot of fun, then there's no chance, right? And so that engagement is far more important than being accurate or fast or anything else like that. And so very often we'll say that the engagement scores are the true test of a manager's ability, right? If there's engagement, then anything is possible. If there's no engagement, then everything is very difficult. And so I was going to share with you just a couple tiny tactics here that you can think about using. So the very first thing is that this John Kotter change model is best known change model, this 8-step model, is probably the opposite of the advice that we give. So this is where the burning bridges idea came from, and it's actually in the book. And he says, so what you do is you increase urgency. You tell people if they don't make the change, the world is going to come to an end. So people don't want to make the change. So you have to make their current state even worse than the current thing. And that's why they actually want to change. And so the fundamental problem with this is that it's a fear-based mode of change. And yet it's something that is very, very, very common in large corporations, right? Like do this or else, do this or you're going to lose your job, right? The second thing is, since we largely believe that fast culture change is not possible, what you can do is you can just start with the people who have already changed for whatever reason, right? And one distinction here is between the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. And so find people who have the growth mindset and put them all together, right? And then do something with that group, which will at least improve that part of the organization. And the way that this looks like for me is that it often involves like trying out cross-cutting groups after cross-cutting group after cross-cutting group, right? So if we're thinking about like the team level, you go to each group and you say like, you know, who wants to volunteer? And like, you know, 2 people will say from each group, I want to volunteer. And then you get all of those people in one room, and then they're starting to talk with each other, right? And then 50% of them will drop out after the first conversation, and then you'll have to reorganize the group again. But you're constantly asking this question, right? Who is it that wants to embrace any challenge, never give up, see effort as a journey, learn from criticism, et cetera, or on the right side of this growth mindset, right? So it's not that you're changing people, it's that you're identifying the people who are interested in going along this path. Another simple thing, just a very tactical thing, is just boil everything down to these 2 things, proto-Kanban, which is to visualize all of the work and limit work in progress. I often ask, you know, sort of large corporations, I'm working with a national government now, and I ask them, you know, so there are these 2 things that like the 2 simplest possible things, like put all of your work on a board and limit the amount of work that you're doing. How long do you think it will take to do this? And, you know, the answer is in years. And so what that does is it starts giving, you know, some sense of, you know, how long this is going to take and what is actually possible, right? So that we get out of this, you know, control mindset, like you have to do this as quickly as possible or the world is going to blow up. And we just say, okay, look, you know, if visualizing all the work and limiting work in progress is going to take a year, then let's be honest and humble with respect to that. And then the final thing, super tactical, if you've never seen this, this is a very fun book, very inspirational book, at least I found it. where he talks about language, the language between a manager and an employee. And so it starts off at level 1 and goes up to level 7. So in the lower right-hand corner, the manager says to the employee, I will tell you what to do. The employee says, tell me what to do. So that's what most organizations are. And then the next level, the manager says, what do you see? So they're using the employee to, detect as a sensor. And then the employee says, I see. Manager still makes all of the decisions, but now they're seeing more because they're seeing through all of their employees. Now they ask, well, not just what do you see, but what's going on in your head, right? How are you bringing everything in? What would you like to do? Now we're getting into preference. And then finally, at the very top, we have what have you been doing? So that means that now people are autonomous, right? And they can do a whole bunch of stuff and they just can tell the manager when stuff is going on. And so it's useful to find out, number one, where you are, how you're interacting with other people in the organization, and you can think about moving up or where it is that you want to be in any particular case. So with that, I will stop. And if there are any further questions, I'm happy to do my best to answer them.
No, really great. I loved the sentence. Way we overcome resistance is not creating it. Yeah. Easier said than done, obviously.
But here's the secret, though. The secret is you are creating the resistance. Because if you weren't pushing, there would be nothing to push against.
True.
So
Agreed.
if you sense resistance, then all you have to do is to stop pushing.
Yeah.
True. And the resistance.
No, but just to bring it back, the earlier question I asked and you answered, the CEOs, CTOs, etc., having the C-suite really having short terms now compared to what they used to have. So they come with a very specific agenda that by this time we want things to be done. So there is a big level of push happening. Yeah. Where do you see Agile coaches sitting in such a situation where the push is happening from the C-suite? And once a push starts happening, possibly there is going to be some sort of resistance as well happening. And we as change agents getting into the organization are somewhere, I think, caught in the middle. We are trying to push those changes as well. So
yeah, so that's exactly the change that I would suggest and that I try to do, which is instead of saying, okay, you want this change, let me go and do it for you, right, which is the typical situation that Agile coaches find themselves in. You work with the C-level executives and to answer the question, how are you going to create the change? Right? Good. And then you get out of the way. Like I mean, the last thing you want to be is in between the executives and the people that they're managing. Right? Like that is a no-win situation. Like I would go to the point of like, if you find yourself in that situation, get 6 months worth of savings and resign. Because you are never going to be successful and you are going to lose years of your life. And you can be very unhappy, right? Like there's no way to be successful in that situation, right? Either the C-level executives will hate you or the people will hate you, right? Yeah. And you won't be able to sleep. You'll have insomnia and you'll get sick, right? Like that's my prediction for what happens to Agile coaches in that situation, right? And so that was just like an upstream mistake, right? And it's understandable. We all made that mistake. Just stop making that mistake and to get into a different situation.
Yeah, great. Another situation, so sorry, I'm asking lots of questions.
Yeah.
Another situation which I've seen typically is lots of places, especially in the technical teams, they want to go the Agile way. Yeah. But especially the middle management, what I mean by the middle management is the program management layer, etc. They still want to follow the traditional approaches. Okay, we need to have a very solid plan, those sort of things. Yeah. So here the change is really bottom up rather than top down. Correct. So how do you handle such a situation?
Yeah. So like in all situations like that, what's happening is that there's a group of people that want A and a group of people that want not A. And what you can do is you can point out to the organization that it is in conflict with itself, right? And so in the United States, there's this famous president called Abraham Lincoln that said, a house divided cannot stand. This was like in the time of slavery. right? Half the states wanted slavery, half the states didn't want slavery, right? So a house divided cannot stand. So this is what you can always come back to the folks and say, like, okay, you need to make a decision here. Either you two need to get on the same page, or the hierarchy needs to ask you to be on the same page, right? What you can say as an Agile coach is that it's totally unacceptable and it's not winning for a house divided because it will not stand, right? The key thing is that you do not want to be the person going to program management and convincing them that they're wrong. Because like in that particular example that you give, you're effectively telling program management that they no longer really have a job, right? Because that's their job. Like, so you're never going to win that argument, right?
Yeah.
You know, and it's going to be horrifying, right? Because they're going to do all these things to you, right? They're going to confuse you. They're going to turn you upside down. They're going to say bad things about you. They're going to make you look dumb, right? So it's a terrible situation to be in because their very life is at stake. You're telling them your job is not good, right? So you don't want to be in that situation.
Yeah, I agree. Great. Thank you. Any more questions, please? No?
Yeah.
Great. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. As Scrum Masters, we have a accountability to make a team more effective, but we've also got accountability to help the organisation be more effective. So interested in what you think about the tensions between those two accountabilities.
Yeah, so I'll say one thing. So I think in the Agile world, you know, we read this statement in the manifesto that talks about autonomous teams, right? And so an autonomous team is, you know, the vision is like it can make any decision it wants, do anything it wants, and basically the mothership is going to send a paycheck every couple of weeks in, right? So as a practical matter, right, that requires an extremely advanced set of practices and culture, right? So I think that a better phrase, which was coined by a friend of mine, Michael Sahota, is we want responsible teams, right? We want teams that acknowledge the fact that they're part of an organization, acknowledge the fact that, you know, the manager 3 levels above them might have an opinion on something and might like say, look, I need this statistic to do my job, and you need to collect this metric because I need it to do my job. And I know that it doesn't help you to collect this metric, but it helps me. And since we're part of the same organization, we need to help each other out, right? And so what we want is both sides to be responsible to each other. And that's a constant dynamic, right? Like it isn't a static fixed point. It's like a balance beam, right? Like going back and forth, figuring out what the balance is.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I like the analogy. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Any more questions, please? No? Great. Let me just quickly share my screen. Thank you very much, Michael. Very interesting session. Really learned a lot and some very practical, helpful tips to actually take back and practice those. Yeah.